Welcome to Michelle's Podcast News, where we bring you the latest updates from the podcasting world. I'm your host, Michelle Tandler, and today we've got some exciting news to share. We'll dive into the return of a beloved podcast, the launch of a new podcast series by Variety, and much more. So, let's get started. Peter Kafka, a veteran media and technology journalist, is reviving his old Recode Media podcast under a new name, Channels, with the Vox Media podcast network, he told Axios in an interview. This is big news because Kafka's podcast was considered a must-listen for media and technology insiders for nearly 8 years. When he left Vox Media last fall for Business Insider, no long-form interview show that catered to the same audience replaced it. Kafka will continue to write full-time for Business Insider as a chief correspondent, but he'll also work with Vox Media as a production, distribution, and sales partner for Channels. He worked out an arrangement with Vox Media's chief executive officer, Jim Bankoff, where he'll own the podcast, giving him freedom and flexibility. Asked why he chose Vox Media over other podcast partners, Kafka said, "You really can't undersell how important it is to have an established operation that doesn't just tolerate podcasts, but embraces them and has figured out various ways to monetize them, distribute them, and promote them." Listeners can expect a similar experience to Recode Media. Channels launches Wednesday as a weekly show featuring long-form interviews with senior executives in the media and tech industries. Kafka will continue to cover the technological disruption of the media industry through interviews that highlight success stories and learning moments. Recode Media followers will be automatically redirected to Channels in their podcast feeds, which means Kafka doesn't need to build an entirely new audience from scratch. The show will be free, supported by advertising, and widely available. Kafka launched the Recode Media podcast in 2016, a year after the outlet was acquired by Vox Media. He left Vox Media a few months after the company sunsetted the Recode brand in 2023. Vox Media has established itself as a home for journalists from other outlets looking to build their podcast brands independently. The Washington Post's Taylor Lorenz launched a video podcast with the company earlier this year. Kara Swisher left the New York Times to bring her podcasting efforts back to Vox Media in 2022. Kafka's first episode of Channels, featuring an interview with the New Yorker's David Remnick, will be out on September 11th. Ironically, Remnick was Kafka's first interviewee when he launched Recode Media in 2016. This is definitely a show you won't want to miss. Variety is set to host its inaugural Shaping Culture with Podcasts event, presented by Wondery, on September 19th in Los Angeles. This exclusive event will focus on the significant impact that audio storytelling has on our cultural landscape. The invite-only dinner program will celebrate the contributions of podcast creators and feature a keynote conversation with some of the industry's most influential voices. One of the highlights of the evening will be the presentation of the first ever Variety Creative Impact in Podcasting Award. This prestigious award will be given to Armchair Expert co-hosts Dax Shepard and Monica Padman. Armchair Expert has been a staple in the podcasting world for 7 years, featuring in-depth interviews with celebrities, artists, authors, scientists, and global thought leaders. Now, with its partnership with Wondery, the show will expand its reach by launching video content in addition to its existing audio format. Previous recipients of Variety Creative Impact Awards include notable figures like Robert De Niro, Angela Bassett, Javier Bardem for acting, Todd Phillips, Baz Luhrmann for directing, and Aaron Sorkin, Ryan Johnson for screenwriting. This award highlights individuals who have made significant contributions to their respective fields, and it's exciting to see podcasting being recognized alongside these other influential media. Variety's co-editor-in-chief Cynthia Littleton will sit down with Shepard and Padman for a keynote conversation following the awards presentation. This conversation is expected to delve into the journey of Armchair Expert, its impact on listeners, and what the future holds for the podcast as it joins the Wondery family. Wondery Chief Executive Officer Jen Sargent will also take the stage to provide attendees with an inside look at Wondery's current strategies and the future trends shaping the podcast industry. This segment will be particularly insightful for anyone interested in the business and evolution of podcasting. Variety has covered the rapid expansion of the podcast industry since its inception and knows the vital role it plays in influencing our culture, said Dea Lawrence, Chief Operating and Marketing Officer at Variety. We are thrilled to host this event in collaboration with Wondery to highlight the players leading the industry's growth and innovation. Angie Moore, head of ad revenue at Wondery, added, "Shows like Armchair Expert sit at the intersection of entertainment and culture. We're so excited to welcome Dax and Monica to the Wondery family and look forward to super serving their loyal fans with engaging new content and experiences." For those unable to attend, conversations from the dinner will be available on Variety.com following the event. This ensures that the valuable insights and discussions shared during the evening will reach a wider audience, further emphasizing the importance of podcasting in shaping culture. Big media companies are paying big bucks for big podcasts. But what, exactly, makes shows like The Joe Rogan Experience, Call Her Daddy, and New Heights worth millions of dollars? It could be the quality, not just the size, of the podcast audience that justifies the high price tags for companies like Spotify, SiriusXM, and Wondery, which in turn sell ads into these shows, according to new research from Morning Consult. At first, the podcast space was this sort of refuge for smaller brands that didn't have the budget to play on television. Ellen Briggs, Morning Consult Brands analyst, told Marketing Brew. But now it's essentially television for very rich, well-engaged consumers, so obviously everyone wants to get in there. Frequent podcast listeners, defined as people who listen to podcasts at least once a week, make more money than the general population, and they're not particularly stingy with it, according to a Morning Consult report based on surveys conducted from August 27th, 2023 to August 27th, 2024, among more than 68,000 respondents. Frequent podcast listeners are slightly more likely than the general population of United States adults to make at least $100,000 per year and have investments worth $50,000 or more, per the report. Frequent listeners are also more likely to have advanced degrees, full-time jobs, and high-ranking job titles like Chief Executive Officer and Director. Outside of work, this group spends money on products and experiences more than the general population does, making them super consumers. Briggs said, about 3/4 or 72% of frequent listeners shop on mobile apps at least once a week, Morning Consult found, compared to closer to half or 57% of all United States adults. About 1/4 or 27% of podcast enthusiasts shop on social media weekly, compared to 16% of all United States adults, and 55% use meal delivery services that often, compared to 37% of the general United States adult population. Podcast fans also over-index when it comes to eating out at restaurants, attending live events, traveling, and exercising. They have more money than the general population, and they are looking to spend it in every way possible, Briggs said. Based on this profile, it's a pretty good bet that you will get some sort of return on an investment in podcast ads. Beyond their own spending habits, regular podcast listeners are also positioned to make recommendations to others and participate in culture, per the report. They're more likely to use every platform that Morning Consult tracks across social, news, and streaming, and the gaps between their consumption and that of all adults are significant, Briggs said. There's a 21 percentage point gap between the share of podcast fans, 55%, and all United States adults, 34%, who use Reddit. The gap is 18 points on X and 16 points on both LinkedIn and Instagram. There are similar gaps between the shares of frequent listeners and the general population when it comes to consuming news from the New York Times and CNBC. HBO and Hulu content is similarly more commonly consumed by the podcast audience. Their presence on these culture-driving platforms makes them all the more lucrative for advertisers, as they're likely to make recommendations if they hear about a product they like, Briggs wrote in the report. A podcast listener can go and be a mini advertiser of your product to their own personal networks, she told us. They're a second line of offense for brands. They're out there in the world, and they're not afraid to have a voice of their own and use it to talk about what they're using and doing in their lives. Our last story today takes us to the world of true crime podcasts, but with a twist. Two Stanford seniors, Grace Carroll and Kylie McPeak, have launched a new podcast series called True Crime Podcast, which investigates the true crime podcast industry itself. Their 6-part series debuted on September 8th and delves into the ethical, legal, and cultural impacts that true crime media has on the crimes they cover. The idea for the podcast came to McPeak after the brutal quadruple murder of 4 college students in Moscow, Idaho, in November 2022. She noticed that true crime podcasters and social media influencers were flocking to the scene, potentially interfering with the police investigation. McPeak felt there was a meta-story about how the true crime industry impacts legal processes, and she decided to explore it further. At Stanford, McPeak teamed up with Grace Carroll, and the two began researching the true crime podcast industry for a thesis project supported by Honors in Arts and the Bill Lane Center for the American West. They interviewed dozens of sources, including scholars, journalists, and relatives of victims, to understand how true crime media affects the cases they cover. One of the most compelling aspects of their research involved speaking with people who had been directly impacted by true crime media. They interviewed Amanda Knox, who was wrongly convicted of murder in Italy and later cleared of the charges. Knox now hosts her own podcast on true crime issues and shared her experiences with Carroll and McPeak. The True Crime Podcast uses various storytelling formats, from journalistic serial narratives to more casual, conversational styles. Carroll and McPeak even play with the tropes and production methods commonly used in true crime podcasts, making their series both a critique and a participant in the genre. While their podcast does address real-life crimes, the focus is on the true crime media itself. McPeak explained that the crimes covered in each episode are about the true crime podcasts at the center of the stories, rather than the crimes themselves. The duo spent over a year on the project, writing, editing, and producing the entire series themselves. They recorded all 6 episodes at a studio at Stanford, ensuring a high-quality production that matches the standards of the industry they are investigating. Carroll and McPeak followed journalistic codes of ethics in their research and production, but they also aimed to make the podcast entertaining. "We wanted it to be fun for people to listen to," Carroll said, "and we wanted it to be compelling, emotional, scary, and all the things that true crime podcasts are." So, what did they find? Carroll and McPeak's exploration scrutinizes how true crime media interacts with the world culturally, economically, and legally. While they provide a qualitative assessment of the industry's impact, they save their big reveal and final verdict for the end of episode 6. That's it for today's episode of Michelle's Podcast News. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you found these stories as fascinating as I did. Be sure to join us tomorrow for more updates from the podcasting world. Until then, I'm Michelle Tandler, signing off.